This is not just another story from Africa. It is not a routine military deal, nor a piece of paperwork destined to be forgotten in dusty archives. What we are about to uncover is a decision that could alter the destiny of an entire nation, Burkina Faso, and place its young leader, President Ibrahim Traoré, at the center of Africa's awakening. For years, Burkina Faso has lived under the shadow of insecurity, terrorism, rebellion, and uncertainty, eroding the hope of its people. Yet against this backdrop of hardship, a single question arises. Why did President Ibrahim Traoré turn not to Western powers, not to France or America, but to Pakistan? Why choose this unlikely partner to shape the future of his country? The answer is not merely about weapons. It is about survival sovereignty and the courage to stand firm in a world dominated by giants. And as we follow this journey, we must ask ourselves, is this the beginning of a new chapter in Africa's story? Is this the dawn of a leader who dares to dream beyond imposed boundaries? If you believe Africa's awakening has begun, subscribe now and stay with us until the end of this story. When Ibrahim Traoré assumed leadership of Burkina Faso, he inherited a nation on the brink. Villages burned by terrorists, families torn apart by violence, and soldiers struggling with outdated rifles and aging trucks. The situation was not just unstable, it was existential. Without decisive action, Burkina Faso risked collapsing entirely under the weight of insurgency and despair. Traoré's challenge was clear. To protect his people, he needed more than courage and speeches. He needed tools of defense strong enough to match modern warfare. Yet Western nations, once seen as traditional partners, offered little beyond lectures and conditional aid. That is why his eyes turned eastward to Pakistan, a country with decades of experience in building effective, affordable, and battle-proven weapons. The agreement he struck with Islamabad was unlike any other in Burkina Faso's history. It was not only about purchasing machines of war. It was about receiving training, technical support, and the blueprint for a stronger, self-reliant army. At the center of this deal stood three pillars of military power: the JF-17 Thunder fighter jet, the Al-Khalid main battle tank, and Pakistan's increasingly capable drones. Each weapon system was chosen with purpose. The JF-17, a multi-role fighter, promised to secure the skies against both insurgent incursions and foreign threats. The Al-Khalid tank offered firepower and mobility across deserts and rugged terrains where extremists often hide. And the drones, silent, precise, and low cost, would give Burkina Faso the eyes and reach it had never possessed before. This was not simply about upgrading an arsenal, it was about rewriting Burkina Faso's place in the balance of power. For the first time, the nation's soldiers could face their enemies with confidence, and its people could believe that their government had the means to shield them. But as we will soon discover, this historic pact is only the beginning. What lies beneath is far more profound, a shift that could change not only Burkina Faso, but the future of Africa itself. The heart of the agreement between Burkina Faso and Pakistan beats through its weapons machines not only of war, but of symbolism. The JF-17 Thunder fighter jet stands at the forefront of this transformation. Sleek, versatile, and battle-tested, it is a multi-role aircraft capable of air combat, ground strikes, and border surveillance. Unlike Western jets that cost billions and arrive with strings attached, the JF-17 offers affordability without compromise. For Burkina Faso, this means a modern air force that does not bankrupt the state but still inspires fear in its adversaries. Then comes the Al-Khalid tank, known for its speed, precision, and lethal 120mm gun. In a region where insurgents often exploit harsh terrain to their advantage, this tank provides unmatched mobility from deserts to rocky hills, from muddy plains to remote strongholds. Its armor resists enemy rockets, while its fire control systems ensure accuracy in the dead of night or the haze of rain. For the soldiers inside, it is more than steel. It is a shield, a guarantee that they can advance without being sacrificed. And yet perhaps the most decisive addition lies in Pakistan's drones. Silent watchers in the sky, drones like the Barak and Sharpar change the entire landscape of counterinsurgency. With surveillance capabilities lasting hours, they track movements and strike with laser-guided precision. For Burkina Faso, this means fewer young men dying on the front lines and more victories achieved without unnecessary loss of life. The symbolism here is powerful. A nation once blind to the threats at its borders can now see everything and strike when it chooses. Each of these systems is more than a purchase. They are statements. They declare that Burkina Faso is no longer a passive victim of global instability. With Ibrahim Traoré at the helm, the nation now projects strength, resolve, and independence. The excitement among soldiers is palpable. Their confidence grows as they realize they finally possess weapons equal to the fight. But the true test lies not in the machines themselves, but in how this shift reshapes Burkina Faso society and the perception of its people. That is where the story deepens further. Inside Burkina Faso, the arrival of these weapons created more than just military capacity. It sparked a wave of national emotion. For decades, ordinary citizens had lived with doubt, wondering if their country could ever rise above its vulnerabilities. Now, for the first time, they saw a government equipping its army with the tools of a modern state. Young men and women, inspired by the sight of new jets, tanks, and drones, began to view military service not as a sacrifice of despair, but as a path of pride and honor. President Ibrahim Traoré's decision resonated beyond strategy. It touched the human spirit. People in the villages whispered with hope perhaps their children would grow up without the constant fear of raids. Mothers in the marketplaces felt reassured that a shield was being built around them. Even the soldiers once weary of fighting with outdated rifles walked taller, knowing their courage was now matched by technology. Yet outside Burkina Faso, reactions were mixed. In Africa, many observers celebrated the boldness of the move. They saw in Traoré's choice a rejection of dependency on former colonial powers and a declaration that Africa could chart its own alliances. Africa news and regional outlets began framing Burkina Faso as a symbol of defiance, proof that even smaller nations could seek strength on their own terms. But in Western capitals, silence was telling. Analysts in Washington, Paris, and Brussels noted the deal with unease. Pakistan, long known for supplying effective lower-cost weaponry, had just opened a door into West Africa. The implications stretched beyond Burkina Faso. If other African leaders followed Traoré's example, Western influence would weaken across the continent. The U.S. media did not shout headlines, but policymakers quietly watched, aware that the balance of partnerships in Africa was shifting. This was the high point of the story. Burkina Faso had not only gained weapons, but it had also gained recognition, both admiration and caution. For the people, it meant renewed faith. For the world, it was a signal that Africa was entering a new phase. But every decision of such magnitude carries consequences. The next chapter is not about weapons alone, it is about how they reshape the very fabric of society and politics within Burkina Faso. For the people of Burkina Faso, the effects of President Ibrahim Traoré's decision went far beyond the battlefield. Ordinary citizens, long accustomed to fear, began to feel the subtle but powerful shift of security returning to daily life. The sight of JF-17 fighters soaring in the skies was more than military showmanship, it was reassurance. It told farmers in remote villages that their borders were not forgotten, and it reminded families in Ouagadougou that the government was no longer powerless against insurgent threats. This new confidence translated directly into society. Enrollment in the armed forces began to climb as young men and women sought to be part of a renewed military that was not merely defending survival, but carrying a vision of national pride. Service in uniform became not just duty, but dignity. In the marketplaces, people spoke of the military with admiration, no longer as a struggling institution, but as a rising shield. The emotional impact was equally profound. For years, the population had looked to the West for promises of stability, only to receive lectures or delayed aid. Traoré's pivot showed them that solutions could come from within Africa's own alliances. This realization stirred a deep sense of independence in the national psyche. For once, Burkina Faso was not waiting for rescue, it was taking action. Politically, the president's image soared. In a region where leaders are often criticized for weakness or indecision, Ibrahim Traoré was perceived as bold, decisive, and protective of his people. His speeches carried more weight, not because of rhetoric, but because he had delivered something tangible: security. The symbolism of new weapons became a metaphor for renewed sovereignty. But beneath this wave of optimism lies a critical question: can the momentum of military pride translate into lasting unity and governance? Can the tools of war also become the foundation for peace? These questions define the next stage of Burkina Faso's journey. While the immediate civilian response was pride and renewed morale, the deeper political effects of Traoré's choice began to reshape Burkina Faso's regional and global positioning. By turning to Pakistan, a fellow nation of the global south, the president implicitly rejected the monopoly of Western powers over African security. This shift was more than a military transaction, it was a statement of sovereignty. Within Africa, such moves resonated strongly. Neighboring states facing similar insurgencies observed with interest how Burkina Faso diversified its defense partnerships. The message was clear: Africa could find solutions through South-South cooperation rather than dependency on former colonial powers. Traoré's decision thus strengthened his image not only as a national leader, but also as a regional symbol of resistance against external dominance. Domestically, the political discourse evolved. Opposition parties, while initially skeptical of the costs, found themselves unable to deny the visible psychological uplift across the population. Critics who once accused the government of inertia now faced a public narrative dominated by security gains and patriotic energy. The president consolidated his legitimacy not through promises but through action. At the same time, the new weapons deal became a tool of political education. Public discussions about the JF-17, the Al-Khalid tank, and surveillance drones moved beyond technical fascination. They became metaphors for national rebirth. School children learned the names of these systems with the same pride their parents once reserved for independence heroes. In sermons, radio shows, and village meetings, people linked the machines of defense with the larger idea of self-determination. However, the long-term political implications are double-edged. By aligning more closely with Pakistan and by extension non-Western blocs, Burkina Faso risks straining its relations with traditional donors whose financial support remains significant. The government will have to balance its newfound military independence with the economic realities of global diplomacy. Yet for now, the prevailing sentiment is that of empowerment. Traoré's decision has shifted the conversation in Burkina Faso from survival to strategy, from dependence to dignity. In politics, as in society, the narrative of weakness is being replaced by one of agency. Beyond morale and politics, the most delicate consequences of Traoré's defense deal lie in the social fabric itself. Security is not only about weapons, but about how citizens experience the presence of the state. For many Burkinabe, the sight of advanced drones or tanks in national colors symbolized a government finally capable of protecting its people. This strengthened the social contract. People began to believe that their sacrifices, taxes, and loyalty were rewarded by tangible protection. Communities long neglected by central authority, particularly in rural zones plagued by insurgency, now sensed that Ouagadougou was paying attention. The psychological barrier between forgotten peripheries and the capital began to erode. Military technology, paradoxically, became a bridge for social cohesion. Another consequence was generational. Young people, disillusioned by years of insecurity and unemployment, now saw the armed forces as a pathway to purpose and pride. Recruitment campaigns drew unprecedented numbers not only because of jobs, but because of the prestige of serving under modern equipment. This trend could reorient an entire generation away from despair and toward national service, planting seeds of civic responsibility. Yet optimism coexists with risks. A military-centered narrative can inadvertently overshadow the urgent need for economic and institutional reforms. If national pride rests too heavily on weapons, there is the danger of militarization of political life, where dissent is equated with disloyalty. Civil liberties must therefore be carefully preserved even as the army's role expands. Moreover, the reliance on external partners, even friendly ones like Pakistan, carries long-term dependency concerns. Weapons inspire unity today, but without parallel investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, the promise of national rebirth may falter. Citizens may soon ask security for what kind of future? In sum, the civilian and political consequences of Traoré's decision are profound. It has given Burkina Faso a rare moment of unity, confidence, and regional significance. But its durability will depend on whether military strength is used as a foundation for broader societal renewal rather than as an end in itself. The international reaction to Burkina Faso's defense deal with Pakistan was immediate and layered with complexity. Western powers, long accustomed to shaping the security architecture of West Africa, viewed the development with concern. France in particular felt the sting. For decades, Paris had positioned itself as the primary guarantor of Burkina Faso's stability, providing troops training and aid. Yet despite these efforts, insecurity persisted. When Traoré turned not to Paris or Washington but to Islamabad, it was interpreted as both a rebuke and a rupture. Western analysts quickly framed the partnership as part of a broader geopolitical shift, Africa seeking alternatives outside traditional Western alliances. Commentaries in European media warned that Burkina Faso was sliding out of the Western orbit and into a sphere of influence defined by new actors Pakistan, China, and perhaps Russia. In policy circles, there were debates on whether sanctions, aid reductions, or diplomatic pressure might be used to signal disapproval. Washington's response was more cautious than Paris's. While the U.S. did not depend on Burkina Faso in the same way France did, it worried about the precedent. If one Sahelian country could so openly reject Western defense ties, others might follow. American officials highlighted concerns about human rights and the risks of militarization, framing the deal not in terms of security efficiency, but governance standards. At the same time, some Western voices admitted the uncomfortable truth: years of Western involvement had failed to defeat insurgency in the Sahel. Against this backdrop, Burkina Faso's pivot toward Pakistan appeared less like reckless adventurism and more like pragmatic experimentation. The symbolic impact, however, was undeniable. For France, the deal represented not only a loss of influence but also a challenge to its narrative of indispensability in Africa. For the U.S., it was a reminder that global South-South cooperation was no longer theoretical, it was happening and in strategic regions like the Sahel. If Western powers reacted with caution and unease, the global South's response was markedly different. Across Africa, leaders and commentators praised Traoré's boldness in diversifying security partnerships. For many, the deal was not merely about jets or tanks, it was about sovereignty. The symbolism of turning to Pakistan, a country with its own long history of resisting Western pressure while building indigenous defense capacity, resonated deeply. In Mali and Niger, where military juntas also face insurgency and estrangement from France, the move was studied with interest. Analysts speculated whether these governments might pursue similar partnerships, potentially creating a bloc of Sahelian states aligning with Asian and Middle Eastern suppliers instead of Western arsenals. Such a shift would represent a structural reorientation of Africa's defense map away from dependency and toward multipolarity. Pakistan itself celebrated the agreement as a milestone in its foreign policy. Officials in Islamabad highlighted the deal as evidence that Pakistan's defense industry was gaining recognition beyond its traditional partners. State media framed the partnership as an example of South-South solidarity, positioning Pakistan not only as a supplier of weapons, but as a partner in the struggle for security and independence. The diplomatic prestige was significant. In one stroke, Pakistan expanded its influence on the African continent and showcased its capacity to compete with Western and even Chinese defense exporters. Other non-Western actors also took note. Russia, already cultivating ties with Sahelian governments through security contractors, quietly welcomed the diversification. China, while less directly involved in arms supplies in this case, likely viewed the development as further evidence of the decline of Western monopoly in Africa. For ordinary Africans, particularly in countries under pressure from foreign troops or aid conditions, Burkina Faso's deal became a story of defiance. Social media buzzed with praise for Traoré as a leader willing to look beyond the old colonial playbook. The deal was interpreted as proof that Africa could craft partnerships on its own terms. Thus, from the perspective of the global South, Burkina Faso's decision was not an isolated procurement, it was a political message. It showed that the age of exclusive Western dominance in African security was giving way to a multipolar reality. At first glance, the deal between Burkina Faso and Pakistan looked like a straightforward military procurement. Fighter jets, tanks, drones, tools for the battlefield. But beneath the surface, a twist emerged that few anticipated. This agreement was not only about defending territory, it was about reshaping identity and power. President Ibrahim Traoré's decision to bypass traditional Western suppliers forced the world to confront an uncomfortable truth that Africa was no longer content to be a client, but was beginning to act as a partner on its own terms. The very act of signing a deal with Pakistan disrupted decades of dependency on Europe and raised the possibility of a continental domino effect. Even more surprising, the deal seemed to inspire a psychological awakening among Burkina Faso citizens. Reports circulated of young men and women flooding recruitment centers, eager to serve in a military they finally believed in. The sight of JF-17 fighter jets streaking across the skies or Al-Khalid tanks rolling in formation became more than military pageantry. It was a statement that Burkina Faso had stepped onto the world stage with newfound dignity. For Traoré, the twist was clear. The weapons were never just weapons. They were symbols of sovereignty, leverage against external meddling, and a rallying cry for unity. In embracing this unexpected partnership, he transformed what seemed like a technical military deal into a strategic narrative of national rebirth. What began as a procurement deal evolved into a recalibration of power in the Sahel. The unexpected twist was not only the hardware itself, but the shift in perception. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just the leader of a fragile nation. He was being framed as a symbol of Africa's defiance. International media, even in the West, started to describe him as the young captain who challenges the old order. Within African circles, his decision to look eastward for strength marked him as a pioneer of a multipolar Africa. And in Washington and Paris, analysts quietly admitted that Traoré had introduced a precedent, one that could inspire others to break free from the decades-long cycle of dependence on Western defense systems. The deeper twist lay in the psychological terrain. Burkina Faso's enemies, terrorist networks and insurgent groups, suddenly faced an adversary that no longer seemed weak or predictable. The image of drones circling overhead, jets invisible to radar, and tanks cutting through desert terrain struck fear before battles even began. In many ways, perception itself became a weapon. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was not just national pride, it was vindication. The message was unmistakable. They were no longer pawns in someone else's game. Under Traoré's leadership, they were reclaiming agency. That is the true twist when a deal on paper becomes a turning point in destiny. Burkina Faso no longer whispers its struggle, it declares it to the world. Under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, this small West African nation has chosen defiance over submission, dignity over dependence. The partnership with Pakistan is more than a military contract. It is a declaration that the age of colonial dictates is finished. This moment is political. It is about sovereignty. It is about a nation standing tall in a world that too often treats Africa as a chessboard. By arming his people not only with weapons but with pride, Traoré has told both allies and adversaries, Burkina Faso will no longer bow. And to every American watching, this is not just Africa's story. It is a reminder of what freedom costs and what it demands: courage, sacrifice, and leadership that refuses to yield. We did not ask permission to be free. We stood up and claimed it. These words should thunder across the globe. They belong not only to Burkina Faso, but to every people who resist domination. If you believe that Ibrahim Traoré embodies the courage of a free Africa, share this story. Subscribe now to join the journey of a continent rising unchained. May God bless Burkina Faso. May God bless Africa.